Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening to all of you. Welcome to our webinar, and we are today talking about tea and herbal infusions. Actually, we are presenting our market study. Today here we have our consultant Gustavo Ferro, and my name is Liliana, and I'm working for Open Trade Gate Sweden, and I will be your host today. So I think the webinarium will be long for 1 hour. First, I will present shortly Open Trade Gate Sweden and how we work, what is our mission there. And then I will give word to Gustavo to present our market study, tea and herbal infusions. And then you will get the possibility to ask the questions. And also Gustavo will answer on your questions. So since we have a webinarium format here, uh, I don't see all the participants, but I do hope that you see us. And I will open the chat function. So when I open a space for questions and answers, you can actually write your question there. And I will ask you to shortly write your name and the company from which you are coming, and then your question, and we will address it. So now it's time actually to shortly begin, and I will take just a few minutes according to our agenda to actually present Open Trade Gate Sweden and how we work. So this will be a short presentation. So once again, for those who are just joining in, to highlight the agenda of the today's webinar. So first, I will shortly present Open Trade Gate Sweden. Then our expert Gustavo Ferro will do a presentation on tea and herbal infusion market study, which we did. And then I will continue with the moderation, and you will get a chance to write questions in the chat function. When time comes, I will open it. Just once more to highlight, it would be good if you write your name and the company name and the question when it's time for it. So now more about Open Trade Gate Sweden. Open Trade Gate Sweden belongs to the National Board of Trade, and we are focused on international development cooperation financed by the Swedish government. We like to say that we have two angles of working. So we work through Open Trade Gate Sweden mainly with the companies, and we support them to become more export ready and to export to Sweden. But also we have other part of our unit and organization which is focused on working with institutions in order to straighten their trade policy and EU alignment processes. So this is how we are actually working through two pillars in order to contribute to, in general, international development in low and middle developing countries. Of course, today we are going to put an accent on more on Open Trade Gate Sweden. So we, Open Trade Gate Sweden, we support the companies in low and middle income countries to export to Sweden and to EU. How we do that? We do that through information, coaching, matchmaking, and we help them through structured process to become more export ready and more adjustable to the Swedish market. And of course, we want to see that the companies from other countries are building sustainable business relationship with the Swedish companies. All this is actually focused on achieving one goal, and that is to contribute to increase export opportunities and greater prosperity in low and middle income countries that are in our focus. Of course, how actually our cooperation between us and our target group and beneficiaries starts. It starts through contact point. So through the contact point, you actually got the link for today's webinar and information about the webinar. It's usually my colleague Oscar that is in charge for the contact point, but today I will actually run this webinar. But in general, contact point is the place where you can get a free information about the regulation standards and buyer requirements in Sweden. You can also get the market information, and you can access to the reports and webinars like we are doing actually today. And through the contact point, you can also get the link to our digital export guide and our methodology, which we called Road to Export. We also have our bilateral projects with the priority countries and the countries where we work and focus on. And our focus area is actually in three sectors. It's tech, textile, and food sectors. And we are, through our bilateral projects, we are trying to match the supply with the demand of the Swedish market. How we do that? So we have developed our methodology, which we call the Road to Export. And when we teach the companies how to become more export ready and the other stakeholders, we actually go and explain all these steps that goes under the road to export. So it's important to understand how to map out the target market, how to live up with the requirements, how to prepare a market entry strategy, how to get ready for the business. And then, of course, you can also get a little bit of the checklist in order to assess yourself as a company, whether you are ready to export or whether you are compliant to the Swedish and EU market requirements. And this build and picture is actually demonstrating how the capacity building process looks like under our projects and our cooperation, but absolutely it's structured and it goes through several steps in order actually to be sure from preparing the companies and making sure actually at the end that they stay on the market. So the goal isn't it just to give the trainings, it's also to support market entry and to build the relationship in the market and to actually stay on the market so that we have like sustainable market entrance there. So I think I will now stop to share my screen. So, and it's time to talk about focus of this webinar. I hope I managed to give you the picture how Open Trade Gate Sweden works. If you have a further question, you can always address it with our contact point. But now I would like to present Gustavo Ferro. He's the expert working in the food and natural ingredients sector, and I would say also specialized for the ingredients like tea and herbal infusions in general. And Gustavo, you were in charge for preparing a market study. And now we actually start to present the main conclusions of the market study for tea and herbal infusion. Thank you, Gustavo, for being here, and I'm giving the floor to you.
Thank you so much. So also to contextualize, I think it's important to mention that the market study comes from the demand. Let's say the demand to understand the market and from the projects that OTGS is working on. So we do take into account when writing the study, the target countries and the products that we've been seeing, right? Like in the projects. And this is super interesting because there is also, like some use to the market study. It's not only to write a market study and to archive it, but also to apply this knowledge. So this is also based on your questions and the things that you guys want to learn. That's also good guidance for any market researcher or any organization. So this is also interesting to us to hear some feedback. Just to make a note here. We wrote this market study on tea and herbal infusions, and I just wanted to show you guys what we are discussing today. We're going to cover a little bit of the notes and considerations because what I wanted to do is to frame what the study covers and also the expectations in terms of how it can be applied. And then we go through the actual content, which is an overview of the Swedish market in terms of its size and especially focusing on the trade flows. So looking at the imports of this product group and also looking at the Swedish market structure. So what are the channels, entry points, but also the segments on this market? And then looking at the trends, understanding a little bit where the market is heading and also which drivers are shaping this market in Sweden. And then the market requirements. Of course, Sweden is part of the European Union, so the requirements in European Union will also influence the requirements that you would have to enter the Swedish market. Very short note on logistics, because this of course will depend a little bit on the individual strategies. for each company trying to access the market and finishing with finding a business partner. Also, small notes there. And then we go to the Q&A. Just checking if Liliana, you close the camera, just checking. Okay, yeah.
I'm
No,
here,
just
yes.
checking for that. Okay. But just to make sure that you were connected. Just some notes and considerations before we start. The study covers pre-packed teas. So tea, Camellia sinensis, and also herbal infusions, which are not part of the species tea. Usually, this product group can also be referred as herbal teas or other names. So I just wanted to clarify that includes finished products, 100% processed packaged at origin, belonging to the categories of tea, black, green tea, and the herbal infusions mixture. So just to keep that in mind, we're talking about a finished product, not the intermediate semi-finished products that can be used for finished products. And this is important note because we are talking about non-traditional trade flows and the market structure for low and middle income countries is not really established. So we are talking about really observing how partnerships can come about. As you guys know, introducing a finished product to a market is different than introducing a bulk product that can be used as an ingredient. So that's what I wanted to emphasize here. We are not talking about transactions. We are talking about partnerships. When you talk about market structure, when you look at how the Swedish market works, and this is actually a point that I wanted to bring when we start discussing the market channels, it's important to look at the existing business models and aspirational trade channels. You don't have the usual channels that you sell in bulk and then this is processed further. We are talking about a finished product. So this is important to observe which business models already exist on the market. Okay. And then some considerations about market development, of course. Is it under private label that you guys are looking at accessing the market? Is it under your own brand? These are important considerations, not only in terms of market entry, but also your individual approach to the market, given the possibilities. And very important question to consider before starting your market entry strategy is, does your product fit this market? Sweden is one of many markets internationally, and we just wanted to make sure that we give you guys the information and also that allows you to consider if this is a market for you, given its trends, structure, consumer profile, etc., etc. So we are not forcing anyone to enter the Swedish market. What we are trying to do is to give you enough information to make such decisions. Is it for you or not? Does your product fit? This is very important consideration here in terms of market intelligence as well. Liliana is looking at me. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but this is important to emphasize here because when we look at the trade structure, okay, so this is HS code 090230. Which is covering immediate packaging. So black tea, in this case, is the black tea, which is the biggest product group in this group of teas and herbal infusions. With total imports of a little bit over 2,000 tons and a little bit over 23 million euro. I put in euro here, not in Swedish crowns, because it's easier for us to understand internationally. The main origins and suppliers in terms of value for the Swedish market, excluding the low and middle income countries here, okay? So looking at Poland with 50% of the total imports of Sweden, Germany 10%, Denmark 8%, United Arab Emirates with 5%, and Netherlands with 2%. This is excluding the the low and middle income countries. And you might think, wow, there's a lot of Polish brands on the Swedish market then. There's a lot of German brands. And this is not the case because when we're looking at tea packaging and tea blending, the Swedish market doesn't really have a lot of facilities on that. So these also account for under private label that Swedish brands use facilities and these teas are manufactured in Poland, Germany, Denmark, and then they re-enter the Swedish market as a finished product. So the trade flows also register this movement. This is important to understand here. It's not only brands, it's also Swedish brands, Swedish retailers that use the facilities in other countries to have a finished product. And when looking at the low and middle income countries in terms of the total value of imports, it's actually quite impressive because we have Sri Lanka here with 15%, India with 7%, and a little bit of a small share with Kenya with 1%. And again, this is not that we have a lot of Sri Lankan and Indian brands on the market, but also we are going to see later that the production facilities, packaging and blending facilities in those countries is also used by market actors. So this is an important point here on the trade flows. Also, when we look at the green tea, same story. You see here a little bit over the 400 tons, over 6 million euro in terms of imports from Sweden for the green tea, not fermented. And main origin suppliers, again, Poland, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. It looks like a copy and paste from the previous one, but it's just because, of course, companies, when they do custom manufacture, they offer full packages and different formats and different product presentations. And looking at the main origins from low and middle income countries, again, the same story, India, Sri Lanka, and a small share here for Vietnam. Also, you have some smaller shares for the origins outside of the low and middle income countries like Japan, for example, but it's smaller shares compared to those that I'm showing here within the EU. Also, you can imagine that for a Swedish company to do this kind of business within the EU in terms of regulatory framework, in terms of product flows, dealing with customs clearance, etc., is much easier, of course, to deal with a EU manufacturer. But you do have cases of private label and custom manufacturing happening outside, especially in India and Sri Lanka. And looking at the herbal infusions, so here it's a HS code. It's a little bit more extensive HS code. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 digit HS code, which covers the mixtures of herbal and fruit infusions, also prepackaged for retail. So this is quite specific, with total imports a little bit over the 1,400 tons, also with 14 million euro. Main origins, again, being Germany. Germany has good facilities for blending, packaging, etc., that are at the bulk level, but also in finished products. At the bulk level, you have, of course, Martin Bauer, you have Kreuter Mix, yeah, some other players. But here we are indeed talking about the finished products. And also we see a role here for US and Spain for the herbal mixtures that we hadn't seen before for the black tea and the green tea. And main origins outside of, so within the low and middle income countries, looking again at India, Sri Lanka, and a little bit of a share here for Chile. So this is the overview. And why is it important to look at trade figures before starting looking at the market? Because we can anticipate what the trade flows are, market channels, and also the trends. So this is important, and that's usually in market intelligence, we start looking at the trade flows before looking at this map that I show you here. The map that I show you here is a market structure in terms of imports. So you can see here the trade flows between the producing country, so the country that has the tea producer that is working on the field or producer groups and their connections with the manufacturers. This manufacturer connected maybe to an exporter, not exporting directly or exporting directly to a importing distributor that will distribute this further to the different shops and the different Horeca hotels, restaurants, cafes, or to different types of online channels, for example. So this importing distributor is the one facilitating this connection, or a Swedish brand that maybe this tea and herbal infusion manufacturer in the producing country is working under a private label agreement, for example, or directly with the retailer. This is also possible that there is a connection between a private label manufacturer, for example, for the tea and herbal infusion, directly with retailers. And this is, we're going to see that there are some cases on Swedish market already as well under this structure. But this is showing the connection between producing country, how it enters the market, and also how it reaches the different market segments. Why do I start with market segments now to explain where you see the pin here? Because it helps you to understand where your product fits and work your way back to understand how we can get there. This is usually how we are looking at the structure. Ideally, it even starts with the consumers, understanding the consumer mindset and what they want and where they shop for these products, because then we can understand how these products can get there. And that's where I'm going to start with the different Swedish market segments and the different distribution options there. The Swedish market is divided between the 65% approximately at retail and quite a high share for the food service at 35%. And we're going to get to there because you do have specific ways to get to food service within the Swedish market as well, which is also quite consolidated. But it is actually highly segmented at the retail level, actually. You're going to see that the big retail, ICA, Coop, Axfood, they actually account for 90% of grocery sales in the country. I put here other players like Lidl and some other Audi, for example. They do have a role on Swedish market, but of course, purchasing procurement is done centralized in Germany. So in terms of procurement, etc., ICA, Coop, Axfood, they consolidate, let's say, the big retail market in Sweden. And this is, of course, an important channel for distribution of tea brands, both Swedish and also international tea brands. But on the other side of the market, when you look at the spectrum of market segments, we're going to find the specialized tea shops in Sweden. And this is part of sort of a premiumization of the tea sector. Tea is not a simple product, it's actually seen as an experience and an immersive experience. And this is why the specialized tea shops exist to provide consumers with that experience of purchasing origin specific teas, sometimes even single estate leaves coming from single estates in producing countries, traditional brewing methods, for example, and ethically sourced ingredients. So on the one hand of the market, you have the big retail selling brands that are known to the consumers, and then you have the consumers also requesting specialized and premium products and a little bit on the high end. So you do have the channels in Sweden for that. And sometimes you find high-end teas and more specialized products also in delicatessen channels, and not necessarily specialized in teas, but including teas and herbal infusions in their portfolio for gift items, for example, and associated products like coffee, chocolates. And that's why I put this picture here so that you can really think about where and how this is distributed, artisanal products, and really high-end and high quality. So very similar to the specialized tea shops, and sometimes quite overlapping with the idea of specialized tea shops offering gift items and really focus on the high end. And then you have another side of the market, which is also quite premium, which is the health food stores. And this is usually directed to wellness and really oriented into sustainability packaging. That's when you see a lot of the organic certification happening and really having that as almost like a base requirement to have these products offered to consumers that really focus on health. Maybe some of you guys already recognize some of these packagings here, and you will see that there's a mixture of Swedish brands and also international brands that are known to us, like Puka Herbs, Yogi Tea, Zonetor from Austria. So that's where you can find quite a wide assortment, but really focus on wellness. And that's when you see the categories like detox, sleep, etc. So wellness also meaning functionality here. E-commerce, something that is important, something that is growing as well. Of course, targeting e-commerce means sometimes targeting a distributor that has relations with an e-commerce platform. But very important here is this association between e-commerce with specialty products and also the equipment to consume teas. Yeah, so I just wanted to show you guys here the strainer, for example, and other kettles, etc., that are also distributed through these channels. And you have another interesting channel, and I'm gonna talk about this one a little bit more extensively later, which is international food stores. International food stores are usually specialized in what we used to call like nostalgic channels, usually brands that the immigrant populations reminds them of home and the tastes that are familiar to them. And they're usually specialized in imported foods and really the good for foreign communities kind of thing. So you see mixtures of brands that are known to these communities, and you're going to also see that Sweden has a high share of international communities. So it's really catering for that, but it's also an important channel here because I know some of you guys, I saw some of the names that are already there. Maybe you're working with yerba mate, for example. Maybe you're working with products that are very specific to those countries that you have a good brand, that it's sold a lot in domestic market. And this is what we are looking at when you look at international food stores, for example. Ah, okay. So now all of this is to conclude that there are different market segments in terms of quality, in terms of price, also in terms of maybe the quality of the packaging and the raw material. And here you look at the low end, for example, mainly looking at the big supermarkets and how these products they meet, of course, standard quality, but these are usually the mass scale brands. And this is actually shown on the price of the product when we compare with the other ones. Here I put in Swedish crowns, but I can say more or less in euro, we can divide it by 10. Well, maybe by 10, 11, between 10 and 11. You can divide here. You can take a look at the price and keep that in mind because we're going to look at the other products here. 70 Swedish crowns per 100 gram. Okay, so that's kind of the price of this product per 100 gram. But when you look at the absolute price of the product, you see here 26 Swedish crowns. Okay, and I put a brand that is a mass scale brand and looking at the ingredients, which is chamomile. So chamomile is known for calming effects, etc. Keep that in mind because when we look at a product that is in middle range, it's also commonly sold at supermarkets, but usually as a premium line. And usually it can also find these products in the health shops. You can find in other types of retailers where you usually wouldn't find the products that are in the lower end of the market. And this is because these products have a higher value, not only because of the packaging, not only because of the name, but also because of the high quality of the ingredients and origin, for example. When you look at a product which is not a Swedish product, this is a UK brand, Poca Herbs, you see that the price is a little bit higher compared to the 70 Swedish crown per 100 gram. You can see 230 Swedish crown per 100 gram. And the absolute price of the product is 69 Swedish crowns. So what translates into this value is the origin of the ingredients. You can see here chamomile from Egypt, Croatia, and Hungary, for example. So even though it's chamomile, it's more special because it has an origin. The certification, organic certification, they also have the Fairwild certification in Puka, and of course, the whole sustainability mission and the storytelling. When you open a package like this, it has a whole story inside. So it does belong to a little bit more ethical, a little bit more higher end. And there's even a higher end, which is the high end of the market that I'm trying to show here. Not because it's more sustainable, etc., but also where it's distributed in the higher end shops and in the pricing and of course the quality of the ingredients. You see here the compostable packaging and the real attention to detail. It is a simpler packaging, for example, but it denotes high value. You can see the price here. Let's see, 230 to almost 280 Swedish crown per 100 gram, and the absolute price 89. It is a mixture of ingredients as well, so keep that in mind. It's a blend, but it's a blend of high quality ingredients and also sold at a high-end retailer specialized in teas. And you can see here the name also denotes the functionality, sleepy time, which is similar to what we saw before. They're all related to a certain functionality. Sold under completely different market segments, completely different ideas. And I just wanted you guys to think, where does your product fit? You know, when you look at the shops, when you look at this type of market segments, it's important to consider if you're planning on accessing this market, where does it fit? That's my big question when I ask to you guys. And also, not only where it fits, but how does it get there? And that's what I'm going to talk about here, different business models that you can think about when you think about accessing the Swedish market. We have to consider the different possibilities, the different actors on the market, and their requirements as well in terms of your capabilities and your possibilities in terms of production, but also distribution. I'll just see if Liliana, we're getting a lot of questions.
We are getting the questions, but we are going to address it when you finish.
No, exactly. I just wanted to give it a break, just to let people breathe a little bit, because I can imagine it's a little bit intense. It's part of it first.
Yes.
Anyway, so let's look at the possible trade channels. So we first look at the market segments where these products end up. Let's see how they can get there. I want to show something that, well, it's maybe sounds to you guys very far away and everything, which is directly to retail with your own brand. I want to say that, of course, this is difficult, not only because of the volume required and the stable supply capacity, but also competitive pricing. You're going to see that to be listed and to be on the shelves, you really have to do your pricing and your calculation because you have to take into account all the margins along the supply chain. And of course, when you're looking into the pricing that I just showed you here of a supermarket, you have to see if you can meet this kind of requirement price-wise as well. Also, the strong brand identity, of course, because the product needs to sell. We were discussing in Sweden with a few retailers, etc., how many times the product needs to rotate per year. And that specific retailer said, well, 30 to 40 times. So that's quite a lot of rotation that the product needs to have. And the product will only sell, of course, if there is a brand identity and market demand in Sweden or internationally, if you're thinking about other markets as well. Of course, compliance with the Swedish and EU food safety, labeling, and packaging regulations. This is not something to be compromised. It is obligatory to comply. Sometimes if you're working with importer, they can help you with the labeling and etc. with the maybe a sticker for that. But compliance with the packaging regulation, with the information that should be there, that's a non-compromise to be in retail or anywhere on the Swedish market. Marketing support, of course, is necessary because you need to sell the brand and also the storytelling. And sorry to say to you guys, but the sustainability proof is something that is not anymore a trend, and we're going to discuss that later. Liliana always repeats that as well. Sustainability is not a trend, it's a requirement. And here we look at sustainability in integrated way. It's not only having a certification, but how you work with the packaging and how you also address, your whole supply chain. Not only the product, but also how you're dealing with your whole supply chain. Um, we'll come back to that. And also the logistical support. You do need the distributor in order to reach these retailers. So it's not because you have a direct deal with the retailers that this retailer will take care of the logistics. Absolutely. Another option to work with a retailer is, of course, on the private label. This is already a reality for low and middle income countries, especially if you look at countries that have a track record on that, like India and Sri Lanka. I'm not giving you guys any confidential information here because this is on the website. You can search for these things on website, for example, of Coop, Sweden. To work with private label, of course, you need this flexibility in product and very strict food safety and technical standards. And I emphasize this because working under private label means that a retailer is transferring the liability and their liability and their judicial responsibilities to you guys when they work under private label. So you are representing the brand of the retailer when you're producing for them. So that's why retailers are very strict on food safety. And here, food safety, I mean the food safety standards that are recognized internationally, of course. Legislation, of course, super important, and stable supply capacity. Again, I repeat that, competitive pricing as well. Uh, Retailers, of course, they will negotiate on the price and price volume balance. And sustainability, of course, super important here because you're representing the retailer as well as logistical support to distribute this product on the market as well. So it is super important here to when working with retailers to really judge your capacities in those under those components. There's also possibility, of course, of partnership with brands under private label, of course. As I said before, there are not many possibilities in Sweden for blending, for producing these products. So working in partnership would mean that you would complement the manufacturing possibilities and you would provide a service to brands in Sweden. So what does that imply? That you need flexibility in product and also the food safety, super important, technical standards and traceability. I don't know where the raw material comes from. No, no, no. Like you're working under someone else's brand. Not only do you need to know, but also you need to prove that you have the traceability aspects. And of course, the ability to offer and adapt to the Scandinavian design, etc., because it's not your own brand, it's someone else's brand. And compliance, super important as well, sustainability and the authenticity. And I have to say here, services, good relations, and not a transaction. It's really relationship building. And again, this is how Sweden works under this, especially under this product category, relationship building. And then how to sometimes distribute these things to the retailers that we talked about, both the big retailers, but also the smaller, more specialized retailers. That's the role of the importers and importing distributors. But the different importers you work with will also depend on the product profile that you have because they are specialized in the different channels. When I ask you guys to think about where your product fits, will have implications on who you approach because they distribute to different channels. So I mentioned before, I'm going to start with the last one. There are distributors in Sweden that are specialized in food service and catering segment. And it's actually quite consolidated, two or three that are active on this market that actually distribute to the Horeca, hotels, cafes, and restaurants in this case. So important to consider here that when targeting that market, there are specialized retail wholesalers, distributors in that specific segment. There are also specialized distributors for the health foods, the organic items, etc., gourmet, and sometimes specialized in tea and coffee categories, but not so many. So thinking about your product and your market entry, it's also important to think about who's actually attracted by and who would be able to push your products and to sell these products to their existing relations and channels. It's not, again, it's not only a matter of having one box, having one container, having one whatever sold to the market and it's out of your hands. It's relationship building also with the distributor. Okay, I think I emphasized that point enough, so I will move on. Liliana, how are the questions going?
They are coming, but we are going to address it soon.
Okay,
So it's
good.
going okay. Just a short reminder to our participants. So questions you can write in the chat. So you are not able to raise the hand, neither to talk. So it's good to communicate through chat. And we will address
Yeah.
it later when Gustavo finish his part. Thank you so much.
And I wanted to remind you guys also when you think about um, what I was going to say. Wait, I just lost my line of reasoning here. Ah, yeah, the study will be published, of course. So anything that is more elaborate, etc., early next year, of course, you will get the announcement, and it will be published on social media of OTGS as well. What I'm giving you guys here is the basic content. In the study, of course, you have a little bit more elaborate. And I say this because I'm not going to talk about all the trends that I have here on the screen. I will emphasize some of them. So, but you do get the full story in the study. Food safety, I'm not going to talk too much about it because I'll talk about that in the requirements. Premiumization of teas and herbal infusions, how consumers are becoming also more sophisticated in their choices in consuming teas and herbal infusions and how the high-end market has developed in that way, not only physically but also online. The flavor exploration within Sweden, the functional categories being an important market development. Organic certification, you will see a growth there. And tea and herbal infusions are actually one of the important categories. If you look at the total market for tea and herbal infusions, you have more than 20% of that market organic certified. So it's actually quite an important category for organic certification. And also within the trends, we describe in the study the traceability and transparency requirements as well as sustainable packaging. And I'm going to talk further about some of these issues. I find it super important to talk about flavor exploration in Sweden because that defines a little bit how you enter the market as well and how you make choices according to the flavor profiles that you have in your portfolio. So that's why I wanted to emphasize a little bit the fact that in Sweden, more than 20% of the population is foreign born. So you do have a lot of flavors. Swedish consumers have a lot of access to culinary traditions and flavors. So that spills over to tea and herbal infusion sector as well. Examples, the chai with ginger, cardamom, the Japanese sencha, the matcha, and the Ayurvedic herbal teas, super important for this market. One thing that we have observed on Swedish market is the combination with Swedish flavors. So sometimes we have a rooibos from South Africa, but mixed with, I don't know, sea buckthorn, for example, from Sweden. So the flavor combinations and the fact that these flavors sometimes are fusions, it's also something that is done by Swedish brands. So think about that when you think about the flavor exploration. also think about that it's not no longer a niche. Swedish consumers are pretty used to different exposure to different flavors. Functional categories is something that grows internationally, but specifically for Sweden, I put some examples for you guys here. And that comes from a demand from a healthier lifestyle and also from the idea that when you consume a product like that, it associates with the functionalities such as sleep, relaxation, digestion, or digestive health, immunity, detox, balance, women's health, and many other categories that are growing in terms of market development, but also so that you guys think about, of course, the functionality of the herbs that you put in your infusions and the teas that you are using in your portfolio, how those relate to those categories that are growing and how they are marketed in the Swedish market as well. And important here is that the European legislation doesn't really allow for health claims because these are not medical products. So it's okay to have like the basic functionality like it has here, like energy, digestive health, etc. But the actual health claim is not authorized by the European legislation. So this is important to keep in mind. The tea, the herbal infusion, does not cure any conditions. Okay? And that's also coming on the side of the regulation. A lot of the herbal ingredients that are used in infusions, etc., they are under consistent and constant regulatory scrutiny for safety. So a lot of ingredients, even the common ingredients like cinnamon, rosemary, etc., they do go through assessment sometimes on safety and quantities that can be consumed daily by a consumer. Also important to talk about here when you talk about trends about the packaging. And not only is it a consumer requirement to have sustainable packaging, but also regulatory requirement under EU. And because Sweden is part of the European Union, it's important to comply. There are a lot of movements in packaging under the packaging and packaging waste regulation. They revolve around sustainable packaging, biodegradability, and in general, how you dispose of the packaging, but also in terms of the size of the packaging and yeah, the possibility to recycle and a lot of product development in terms of maybe loose leaves, etc., that do not require a lot of packaging use. So the disposal of waste and the idea of your carbon footprint and your footprint, environmental footprint, is super important here. I put an example here from one of the Swedish brands and how they show how they not only they have the sustainable packaging, but also how they show their own sustainability along the supply chain on the packaging. So those issues are a little bit integrated as well. And I also wanted to show you guys a little bit on the compliance aspects for herbal infusions and the teas. And here it's a screenshot of the notifications that European Union has received within Sweden for teas and herbal infusions coming from outside of the country. And these are the most common notifications that you can find here. They relate to pesticide residues, the non-authorized novel ingredients that are not proven to be safe to consumers. You also have issues on hygiene, on rat droppings, you have contamination by salmonella, and you have other issues that were identified here by customs authorities and that are notified. Why is it important to look at those things? Because they relate directly to the requirements. These herbal infusions, they are controlled under different parameters to avoid these issues, to avoid contamination by pesticides, to avoid cross-contamination, etc. So when you're looking at compliance, it's really important to look at if specific issues under contaminants, but also in terms of fraud, adulteration, the addition of novel food ingredients, for example, that are not authorized under EU, and other issues like additives, flavorings, etc. That if they're not authorized, they cannot be used in the products. Under contaminants, you have different types of contaminants, and these relate to the risks that you have in your supply chain. For example, pesticides, pyrrolizidine, alkaloids, for example, that can be toxic to humans that are found naturally in the weeds that surround production or wild collection of some of these herbs, mycotoxins that come from the mold that is formed when there's high humidity, etc. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that come from smoke, for example, heavy metals that can happen naturally from absorption from the soil or cross-contamination, as well as microbiological contamination, for example, salmonella, as we saw one of the cases here under notifications, as well as other issues like you cannot add ingredients that are not allowed by legislation. And I put some examples here, like guayusa, for example, from South America, from Ecuador and other countries. It's still subjected to assessment. Also important to look at the food contact materials, how you package the tea, looking at the tea bags, the sachets, the paper, etc., that there's no migration of any substances to the actual tea that can contaminate them. This is set in the legislation. No unauthorized food additives like flavor enhancers, colors, preservatives, flavorings. No fraud and adulteration. So really declaring the herbs that are actually true to the product. So, for example, if you have another subspecies of oregano, it's important that the botanical identification is done correctly because there are different subspecies that could be toxic to humans, for example, and that prevents allergens, toxicity, etc. And finally, the packaging and labeling. There are specific requirements here in terms of the name of the product, ingredient list, declaration of allergens, the quantity of the product, the best before, the name of the manufacturer or the importer, the country of origin, storage conditions, and the lot number for traceability, the batch code, and also the language. This is super important. There is a mandatory information that should be in the Swedish language because this product will be sold in Sweden. So sometimes it's negotiated with the importer that they can put a sticker, etc. But this is super important that the consumers need to know what is in the product. And consumer information is a big part of labeling. Also to consider in terms of requirements, looking at some of the guides from the Tea and Herbal Infusions Europe. They have good guides on meeting sensory physical parameters, microbiological contamination, as well as observing what your bio requirements could be in terms of food safety, quality management, and all the certifications there that I put on the screen, as well as the sustainability certifications like organic, the CRAV, which is the Swedish certification within the organic, and the sustainability and other sustainability standards and certification that could be quite extensive at company level, but also at product level. I put some examples here, and this is emphasized further in the study. Some considerations for logistics. The transportation mode is important to consider in terms of cost effectiveness. Are you working with pallets? Do you have full containers? Do you have more or less than 500, 700 kilo to justify having a container or using a sea transport, for example, air transport? So also to take into account if you have a very high quality product, how does it go in terms of quality control for moisture, for example, as well as transit times? Is it an urgent order? Does it have to be in Sweden within 5 days? What is your shelf life, for example? So these are considerations when you're considering transportation mode that you should ask yourself. There's some more information in the study on that. Quality assurance, of course, that your product is not going to get damaged, as well as it's not going to be subjected to conditions that lower its quality, for example, during transportation. That can play a decision on the transportation mode that you choose, as well as the sustainability and buyer expectations, for example, in terms of what transportation you use, in terms of the shorter routes that you use or green shipping initiatives, the type of fuel that your shipping line is using. So these are considerations that a Swedish buyer might make when also making a purchasing decision, and the Incoterms. So the responsibilities between supplier and buyer in terms of who does what, in terms of transportation, insurance, etc. There are different options there also for the different modalities that you choose for transportation. Finally, this is the last part, and sorry that I'm running a little bit over the time, but I think we're just in time because we will have around 10 minutes. The how to find buyers or how to find partnerships. Again, a Swedish buyer is not a buyer to work under some kind of transaction. Okay, so this is really much on the profile of the market. You're not going to send an email and sell just a box and that will be it. It's a very specific market, quite consolidated. We'll discuss that in the questions as well. But in order for you to understand the Swedish market better, there are a few associations that you can use to understand the mentality and the type of companies on the market. We have the Swedish Food Federation. Or sorry, at European level, you have the Tea and Herbal Infusions Europe. Does not include Sweden yet. I want to emphasize that, but still, it's an important association to understand the world of tea and herbal infusions in Europe. You have the Swedish Food Federation, you have DLF that focuses on hospitality, and you have Organic Sweden, where you can understand really the companies that operate around the organic market in Sweden and also the distributors there. The trade fairs, you don't have in Sweden, of course, the main trade fair for food and beverages, but maybe that's also not the way to approach the Swedish market, which is very specific. But if you're looking at the wider European market and how the European market works for tea and herbal infusions, including Sweden, you can look at some international trade fairs in Europe, Anuga, Cial Biofac for organic and natural and organic food show in London. But in Sweden, you also have an organic show, which is the Nordic Organic Expo that includes all these sub shows that you can see here: the Nordic Organic Food Fair, the Good Food Fair, Natural Beauty Show, and Natural Health Show. It's all integrated under the Natural Organic Expo, as well as Bite in Stockholm, which caters for the gourmet and the different catering segments and different sort of experimental kitchens, etc. This is it. This is a snapshot of the market that I try to give to you guys in a few minutes. But so can I stop sharing and then we have it like this? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Gustavo. So just a short reminder for our participants to actually write the questions in the chat. In 5 minutes, I'm going to read these questions, but shortly, Gustavo, three things can you summarize? One thing is, in one sentence, what do you think it makes a difference on the Swedish market compared to
Yeah.
the EU market, although Sweden is the part of the EU? Second question, also answer in one sentence, because we have lots of comments here in our chat that our participants are interesting to meet the buyers. So what would be your advice for our participants and SMEs how to approach to the market channels? I think you explained through your presentation, but in one sentence, and at the end, key sustainability requirements and messages which you would give. So if we can just shortly answer on this question, and then I will read the question from our participants.
Okay, so I'll start with the first one. What differentiates the Swedish market? One thing is this consolidation of the market entry and the market channels. You see that all market segments are represented in Sweden, the low end, the high end, middle range, and what was just a question popped up here, so I was trying to. So you do have the market channels, sorry, the market segments represented, but the entry points are actually quite strict. They are actually quite consolidated. So it's not the population of Sweden is not as big as a population like in Germany, in Poland, in Italy, etc. So you're also talking about a consumer base that the consumer base that is looking into products that are true to the claims, products that are high quality and that have good sustainability footprint, etc. But the entry points are quite narrow. The people making decisions, the type of partnerships, it's a construction. It's different from other markets where sometimes products are channeled and sometimes you have a transaction. Okay, it works, it doesn't work. I think Sweden is a lot about building partnerships. Also because we do see that Swedish companies, retailers, and even consumers are very open and they are already exposed to a lot of, as I said before, flavors, international cuisines, etc. So the decision making and the conversations, I think they go a little bit easier in terms of forming partnerships and openness, but the entry points are quite strict, are quite narrow.
Yes, thank you, Gustavo. So I think I can go through our questions in the chat now, if you agree. So I think you answered. There is a lots of questions. We want to meet the buyers, or
Yeah.
we are available for the contacts from the importers. So just to manage expectations, this is a webinar, and this is where we are actually preparing you and presenting you the key information about the markets. So I don't think there are importers here listening all this, but in general, I think you gave a good overview how they can approach and how from where they can start actually in searching the partners. There is a concrete question from Santiago from Argentina.
Uh-huh.
He says, has the use of yerba mate used in South America, North America, parts of Europe and Asia in hot infusions and extracts rich in functional compounds been considered?
Yeah. I think I showed under the boost energy component. I showed a few examples where yerba mate is used. Of course, yerba mate is used in some of these blends. So you would have the approach to this would have to, of course, speak with the brand and how you can supply bulk so that it could be included in the blends. But the other approach, of course, is through these international food stores where yerba mate is, of course, sold as a product to be consumed like it is in Argentina, in Uruguay, in southern Brazil where it's drunk in a specific way and the pure herb. So you have different channels there. If you're selling in bulk, you will. Okay, my first answer, yes, it's included, but mostly as blends and under the category of boost, energy, etc. You see some combinations there as a chai or with some other blends and infusions. And if you're considering the entry with an Argentinian brand, for example, into the market, etc., then I think it's important that is already you have a good domestic market in Argentina. You look at the possibilities of where Argentinians shop, etc. In Sweden, do you have a community there in Argentina to consume these products? And what are the channels there and how to get to these channels under these international food stores if you have your own brand, that is.
Thank you for very comprehensive answer. Before I read the next question, I will just say the ones who were writing in the chat that they are willing to meet the importers or get in touch with the possible clients and buyers. We will share the presentation. And Gustavo, you explained very well the market channels, and you also shared some of the sector associations here in Sweden and in general that can be actually consulted. They have a database of the companies, importers of the tea, and that can be exactly the first
Yeah.
point and the first step. We have a concrete question from Sri Lanka. Can we use organic and non-organic blue butterfly pea flower clitoria as an ingredients for infusions?
I have to check I think it's novel. I have to check. I recommend you access the novel food catalog under you. I cannot put the link right now because I don't have access right now. Novel Food Catalog EU. Put that on, and in the Novel Food Catalog, you can check which ingredients are novel or not. They will have a green check if they are allowed, and they will have like a cross if they're not allowed, or like a yellow. I think is a question mark yellow if it's under assessment, but you have to check individually. I'm not sure if it's if it's already approved by Novel Food or not. So can check. I know in Sri Lanka this is popular and it has like a beautiful blue color, so it does look very good in the infusions.
Then we have a concrete question from also Sri Lanka, the other participants. What are the general certificates and standards, qualities and standards that Sweden markets expect from
Yeah.
tea importers?
Yeah, so the first one is the food safety. Usually, when you're talking about food safety, you talk about the standards that are recognized by the Global Food Safety Initiative, which are FSSC 22000, IFS, and the BRCGS. These are the main ones. And some buyers, they do consider a HACCP certified system as well as being an interesting proposition. But usually, if you talk about retail level, they're quite strict on those food safety certificates. And of course, an ISO 22000 system could also be acceptable, but usually the FSSC 22000 would cover that, and it's an actual certification. So I think it depends per buyer, and also the buyers in which segment. So you have to look at that for food safety. For the sustainability standards. Usually, the organic is very popular, especially in Sweden. A big share of the market, specifically for the tea and herbal infusions, organic, but organic that is audited against EU standards. So your certifier, your certification body needs to be authorized and needs to be authorized to certify for EU organic and other certifications for social compliance. For example, fair trade is pretty popular, but not always required as a certification, but definitely some kind of standard, some kind of proof for governance and social aspects as well. This is a standard that is expected from you, let's say, especially for Swedish market. And given the new due diligence obligations of EU actors, like due diligence just means that they have to be in control on the supply chain. They have to be in control environmentally, socially, and also in the governance of the supply chain.
Thank you, Gustavo. But I think all these informations are detailedly explained in the market
Yeah.
study, which will be shared and officially published on our website. And then the participants can also download and compare to the information which we gave at the webinar. There was one more question regarding sustainability and traceability, but then the participants wrote, okay,
I
you
answered.
talk about it, so it's okay. Okay, so there is a question about yerba mate in
Yeah,
Sweden. Do you have any information about that?
that's the one that I answered already about the.
Okay,
Yeah,
so there is also a question, only organic products or even inorganic is possible in Sweden? I would say
I
so.
don't
It
know what
doesn't need to
inorganic
be.
means in this
Yeah,
context,
I
but
think it's the question, does it need to be organic product or it's possible to be conventional also
there are
to
two
enter
sides.
the
Yeah.
market?
But if it's claimed to be organic, like no, you cannot say bio, organic, or anything if it's not certified by a certification body that is authorized by EU to certify with according to EU regulation. No claims of organic or naturally grown, organic by default is not recognized by EU or Swedish market. Natural, it doesn't mean anything for tea and herbal infusion as an organic certification.
There was another question related to inclusion of yerba mate, but you already explained it. Are we able to share a presentation? Absolutely, presentation will be shared. We have your addresses as well as the recording from this webinar. And there is also question from India. Thank you for the valuable information. Looking forward to show what true sustainability is with our wildlife conservation project in tea, spice, and herbal plantation. Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this. There is also a question that this actually commented that this webinar was very helpful to understand the Swedish market. That's nice to hear. Let me see.
I think there's a
Okay.
question from Iran, Liliana. I
Yes,
see that. Yeah,
given Sweden's strong
yeah.
emphasis on sustainability, how can Iranian tea
Mhm.
and herbal tea products position themselves to meet these expectations and
Yeah.
improve their competitiveness in the Swedish market?
Okay, I think this is super relevant question because the retailers, the importers also have assessment on the risk of specific countries when they are taking purchasing or procurement decisions. Um, I'm gonna speak more generally. I'm not gonna speak about Iran specifically, but I will speak more generally on how this assessment is done. Assessment is done. Okay, how do I say it? Trade is geopolitics as well. Purchases are done based on risk that a buyer, being a retailer, being a brand, makes by sourcing from a specific country. So everything that is political, everything that is happening in the country that could interrupt the supplies, etc., is perceived as a risk by a buyer. What I would recommend to anyone working in a country that maybe is perceived as high risk is to adopt and to communicate what your mitigation strategies are, considering those risks of disruption of the supply chain, of depletion of the natural resources. For example, some countries are known for that, depletion of natural resources. Knowing those risks, how do you as a company, as private sector, address them? Because plays a little bit with the idea of like, I know my country is risky. I know that you might perceive it like this, but this is what I'm doing as an individual entrepreneur to lower the risk for you and to create a partnership.
Mm.
Because indeed, I think the political issues and geopolitics plays a role sometimes in purchasing decisions.
Thank you, Gustavo. And I think we have a final question. I will just once more highlight there was a lots of messages in the chat that to present themselves and also that they are interesting to get in touch with the importers. I mean, these messages are visible to everybody who is listening this webinar. That's good. But in general, my advice is if you are searching for the market channel in the Swedish market, first go through our market study, which will be published on our website soon, and also listen to this webinar. Gustavo shared very good examples how you can reach to the buyers, importers, and target the market channel. Also, I would like to read one more question. It's and then I take one more, and I think it was a full inbox. Can we get the MRL? I think that is a measurement reference values of the Swedish lab and the certification parameters. Do you want to answer on this question, Gustavo, or
The
should I?
MRL, let me the
Yeah,
Swedish pyramids. Okay,
yeah,
MRLs.
yeah.
MRLs, they have so if you go to the MRL database, the pesticide database in the EU regulation in the European Commission website, you have the maximum residue levels that are specific per product. So you are going to find in the pesticide database of European Commission website, in the legislation website, in the regulation website, you are going to put tea, herbal infusion, etc. And then you're going to see the maximum residue levels that are allowed in the EU in general. For Sweden, you need to discuss with your buyers if they have requirements that are stricter than regulation. Regulation will apply to everyone that is a supplier and everyone that is a buyer in the EU. So that's flat. But you do need to discuss with your buyer if they need stricter control, if they need lower levels, even what the regulation says. It could be that it's 20%, 30%, 50%, or zero above the regulation. But first check the regulation.
Great answer, Gustavo. I couldn't agree more. That's exactly how it is. Sweden is also following the EU regulations, so I would assume that the parameters are the same, but it's always good to contact importer or distributor and discuss this with them. There was a question, do you need to fill a form in order to get the webinar record? The answer is no. We have your registration. Since you are actually on the webinar, we have your registration, and based on your registration, which you did before you got a link, we will send out this recording that we just made. And yes, I think I took all the questions. Just a short reminder, because we are a bit limited with the time. We are going to share this video and recording. We just need a few days to actually do the translation and to fix the format, but definitely the ones who were registered to the webinar will get this recording. And then if you still have questions, even if you go through our market study, which will be published on our website, you can always write to our OTGS email. That is the same email where you actually were registering for this webinar, and impose your question, and we are going to make sure that your question is answered. Thank you all for participating in this webinar. We had around 60 participants, and I think you had also chance and opportunity in chat to ask the questions. I think, Gustavo, you managed to answer on the questions which we have. In case that I missed some of your questions, feel free to address them through our OTGS contact point. The presentation and the video of this webinar will be shared with all the participants that were registered and that were present here. Thank you so much. I do hope it was useful. At least I enjoyed, and I can confirm all the information that Gustavo presented. And I wish you all the best, and see you on some of the next webinars. Thank you, Gustavo, and thank you, dear participants.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lilian.